Maureen Kelly was only 19 years old when she went with a group of friends to Canyon Creek Campground near Cougar, Washington, in the summer of 2013. Around 5 in the afternoon that evening, she took off all her clothes and told her friends she was going on a spiritual quest, stating that she would return before midnight. Maureen never came back. Her friends reported her missing the next morning, but investigators quickly realized that this case was much stranger than they had ever anticipated. So what happened to Maureen? Was this a simple case of misadventure in the woods, self-harm, foul play, or another disappearance among the unsettling cases of missing 411? Being in nature while camping or hiking can be a very rewarding and relaxing experience, although most of us know it can also be very dangerous. There are wild animals, temperatures can suddenly drop drastically, or you could get lost, which obviously means it's vital to be as prepared as possible. But not all excursions into nature are planned in advance. It's okay to be a little spontaneous, but even then it's necessary to keep a cool head to ensure you can get out of the woods and return home safe and sound. But sometimes, even the most prepared people on the planet can be overwhelmed by unforeseen circumstances, and Maureen Kelly was certainly no exception. In 2013, Maureen Kelly, known to her friends and family as Anu, was only 19 years old. She was born and raised in Vancouver, Washington, in September 1993, and was raised alone by her mother. Much of Anu's early life is largely a mystery. Her family has been quite reserved about her upbringing, and the only thing we know for sure is that Anu was of Pacific Islander descent. As Anu grew up, she began attending Lewis and Clark High School in Spokane, Washington. It was a school with a lot of history, having first opened its doors in the late 19th century. For Anu, it was a great place to be. She seemed to have made many friends there, and overall it seems to have been a great place to grow up. Her hometown of Vancouver, on the other hand, couldn't have been more different. According to Neighborhood Scout and city data, Vancouver ranks among the 10% of the most unsafe areas in the country, so to say that Anu grew up surrounded by crime would be a huge understatement. I'm sure this influenced Anu's personality and lifestyle choices. Despite being surrounded by the worst of the worst, Anu was an incredibly spiritual person. She loved staying in touch with nature and embraced the most natural aspects of humanity. Anu felt that at the moment we are born, we are as connected to the planet and Mother Nature as we will ever be. In her eyes, as we grow, our connection with the world around us begins to fade as we are influenced by external factors, many of which are less than ideal. When Anu wasn't hiking or being the respectful, carefree person she was known for, she could be found singing or playing the ukulele. She loved posting photos and videos of herself online, enjoying music and nature. She even had her own YouTube channel where she posted about many of her interests, predominantly her music. It was June 7, 2013, when Anu made a post on her Facebook account asking if any of her friends with a vehicle were available to go camping the following weekend. You see, Anu had made plans to take herself and some of her friends on what she described as a spiritual quest. But unbeknownst to her loved ones, this quest would be Anu's last. Some sources claim that Anu contacted her half-sister Sherry to borrow some of her camping gear, but it's unknown whether she ever picked up that gear, or if she had it with her while camping and preparing for her spiritual journey. We don't know much about the details of Anu's spirituality or her spiritual quest, but it goes without saying that she wanted to do everything possible to stay in touch with Mother Nature, and this journey was going to accelerate that process. Sherry would later report that during the phone call with Anu, she seemed very excited about the idea of going camping, and that she appeared as she always did, cheerful and full of life. With transportation sorted and a group of friends to accompany her, Anu headed to campsite number 3 at Canyon Creek Campground, located in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, just 2 days later, on Sunday, June 9th. The site is known for being surrounded by dense foliage and tall trees, making it suitable only for tents. It's the perfect place for a remote getaway, far from the hustle and bustle of everyday life, especially considering that it's practically impossible to bring a caravan or something similar to this area. Many people who have visited the campground describe the surrounding areas as difficult to navigate, as there is a steep slope from the campground into the dense national forest, which covers an area of over 1,320,000 acres. This forest is incredibly large. When the group arrived at the campsite, the weather was mild, around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no threat of rain, and everything seemed very idyllic for an afternoon of camping. There was no indication of whether the group of friends ate or drank anything while they were there that afternoon, but one would assume they made a campfire at some point, as it would soon start to cool down. There has been much speculation about whether the group consumed alcohol or something else while they were in the forest. Many people claim this may have led to the terrible series of events that followed, but the reality is that this information is simply not available. No one from the group has spoken about it, so I can't say anything for sure. Regardless of this, everything seemed to be going exactly as planned that afternoon until around 5, when Anu suddenly announced to the group that it was time to start the spiritual quest she had been planning for so long. Declaring that the moment had come, she surprised everyone when, without warning, she took off all her clothes, including her shoes. She acted as if it was no big deal, but her friends were all shocked, to say the least. Immediately after doing so, she grabbed a fanny pack that contained a compass, a small knife, and a box of matches. Then she turned around and headed into the woods, telling her friends that she planned to return before midnight. Many people have wondered why Anu's friends didn't stop her from going into the forest alone, especially since she was incredibly unprepared. But according to Sheriff David Cox, her friends felt this was something she needed to do since she had been talking about it for a long time. I would like to know more about her mental state at that time, as well as the specific details of her spirituality, because it could help shed a lot of light on this case. But unfortunately, that information is simply not available. What is clear is that for Anu, this journey was not something she suddenly decided she wanted to do. In her mind, this was something she needed to do. As Anu walked away from her group of friends, she gave them one last smile before heading into the forest, never to be seen alive again. The term missing 411 refers to people who have disappeared under strange circumstances within a national park. Unfortunately, Anu's case is the very definition of strange. Anu's friends patiently waited for her to return as she had promised, but when the temperatures began to drop to 40 degrees and light rain began to fall, they grew worried as she wasn't wearing clothes and would be at the mercy of the elements if she didn't return to the campsite soon. She had matches, so she would have been able to start a fire, but if the rain worsened, that fire would be useless. When midnight came and Anu didn't show up, her friends felt something had to be done and contacted the Skamania County Sheriff's Office to report Anu as a missing person. A search team was quickly organized, and as soon as it began, detectives felt there was a good chance of finding her, as they quickly discovered barefoot footprints not far from the campground that were estimated to be the same size as Anu's feet. The footprints led them to Canyon Creek, which is not far from the campsite, and it was determined that she crossed the creek, apparently without any issues. Many people have expressed amazement at the fact that she got that far, as the path from the campground to the creek is very steep and would not have been easy to traverse, especially without shoes. Equally astonishing was the fact that she then apparently climbed the other side of the canyon, which is also very steep and seemed to reach Forest Road 54. But unfortunately, this is where searchers could no longer find any more footprints, and therefore had no idea which direction Anu might have walked. It was as if she had reached the road, and then vanished. There were no signs of a struggle, no clues, no evidence, nothing. It was genuinely as if she had disappeared from existence. The decision was made to bring in search dogs from a nonprofit company called Pacific Crest Search Dogs to assist in the search, but they were unable to track Anu's scent. At one point, searchers considered calling helicopters to help search from the air, but it was already the next day and a thick cloud cover had formed, making this mission impossible. Unwilling to give up, the searchers continued combing the area for the rest of the day, but they couldn't find any trace of Anu and had no choice but to suspend the search when night began to fall, as their efforts would now put more lives in danger. They resumed the search the next morning, but again they were unable to discover a single clue about which direction Anu had traveled, and her family and friends began to fear the worst. She had now been naked in the forest for several days. The temperatures had dropped multiple times. The rain and mud now covered the ground, and conditions were severe, to put it mildly. But what is incredibly strange is that the search efforts were called off after only 2 days, which is a very short time in a missing persons investigation. Often rescue personnel search for clues for weeks, even months. But in Anu's case, this simply did not happen. It is unclear why this decision was made, given that the forest is huge and Anu could have walked in any direction that had not yet been searched. This decision admittedly seems incredibly irresponsible, but I feel we must assume the sheriff's office had its reasons. Anu's family and friends then made an urgent appeal, speaking to the media and pleading for the searchers to continue their efforts. This had the desired effect, and the search did indeed resume that same week. But many people who followed the case still wonder why the decision was made to suspend the search in the first place, as no explanation was ever given. This wasted a large amount of crucial time, considering that Anu had no food, no water, no hope of shelter. I am baffled by how they could have tried to give up after less than 48 hours. One interesting aspect of the search is that some searchers stated that the underbrush was so dense that they could probably walk directly over someone lying on the ground and never even notice them. They feared that the chances of finding Anu after being exposed to the elements for nearly a week were now slim to none. This is a very old-growth forest, so it makes sense that the low vegetation would be quite substantial. Anu's friends and family waited day after day, hoping, praying, begging for some kind of news. As fate would have it, they received news only 6 days later, but it was not what they had hoped for. At 6 p.m. on June 15th, just 6 days after her disappearance, Anu's friends and family were informed that the search for Anu was officially canceled. Not a single trace of her had been found, and given that the likelihood of her having succumbed to hypothermia due to the low nighttime temperatures was very, very high, the authorities stood firm in their decision this time. It was announced that Anu was presumed dead, and that was it. Not a single trace of Anu has been found even after all these years. It has been nearly 11 years since Anu ventured into the wilderness on her own, and to this day, no one knows where she went, what happened to her, or if she was trying to make her way back to the campsite when she disappeared. As with most unresolved missing person investigations, those who followed the case closely have their own theories about what happened to Anu, and some of them make much more sense than one might expect. This is not one of those typical missing 411 cases where everyone suspects some kind of alien abduction. No, this case hits very close to home for many people, and some of these theories may be correct. The most common and probably the most likely theory is that Anu got lost in the forest and, without clothing or other supplies like food to keep her warm, had to shelter herself during the night, planning to finish her journey in the morning. While this would have been a good idea under normal circumstances, Anu would have been much more affected by the low temperatures and the light rain that fell, leading many people to believe she succumbed to hypothermia while she slept. The reason she was never found? Well, it's entirely possible that an animal carried her away, as disturbing as that sounds. One would think that if this were the case, Anu's remains would have eventually been found, at least in part. But since there is a considerable amount of wildlife in the area, it is also highly likely that there was simply nothing left for rescue workers to find, especially considering the dense underbrush. The next widely debated theory involves Forest Road 54. It is here where all of Anu's tracks stopped after her footprints led the searchers there, and since it's a paved and well-maintained road, it has led to some interesting speculations. Most people believe that Anu never crossed the road since her footprints were not found on the other side, so it has been suggested that she either followed the road before venturing into another part of the forest, or was picked up by someone when she reached that point. And this is the theory I also find most plausible. After all, we know that the area Anu came from was filled with crime and was dangerous. Can you imagine what would happen if one of these criminals passed by and saw a 19-year-old girl naked on the side of the road? Another theory that has been suggested is that she planned to be picked up in advance, without her friends and family knowing. It's possible that the entire situation was premeditated, and Anu simply left to start a new life. However, I admit this theory is very unlikely, as no one in her circle believes she had any reason to want to disappear, let alone in such an unorthodox way. The prevailing theory for most people is that Anu simply arrived at the road at the wrong time, resulting in her being taken against her will. But this theory has been highly criticized as it seems somewhat sensationalized in most media reports, and since investigators have stated they do not suspect foul play in her disappearance. But the theory that she was picked up by someone could make sense, as the search dogs couldn't find her scent after reaching the road, and since she was barefoot, one would imagine that her scent would remain for some time if she had left the area on foot. If she ever stepped onto that road that day, I'm sure the dogs would have found something, anything. The fact that her trail stopped there so suddenly, well, it just seems suspicious. But not everyone is convinced that Anu lost her life. One of her friends, a woman named Yasmin, stated that there is always the possibility that she simply went into the forest with no intention of ever returning. She has been quoted in multiple sources as saying, "She may not want to be found." This theory could, in fact, be correct. One final idea is that, given Anu's approach to life and her spiritual nature, she may have taken illegal substances before going on her quest. But Sheriff Cox stated in an interview that there was no indication that she had taken any such substances or any alcohol, and that it was much more likely that she was simply eager to go into nature alone, then got lost or failed to find shelter in time. It is entirely possible that Anu is still alive somewhere, but given her loving nature, it seems much more likely that if this were the case, she would have reached out to her loved ones at some point to assure them that she was okay, and that they no longer needed to worry about her. Whatever the case, Anu's disappearance has never been resolved, and at this point it seems very unlikely that her family and friends will ever receive the answers they so desperately seek. I still remember the day we lost Juana. It was the summer of 1991. I was 12 years old, an eager Boy Scout with a worn-out pair of boots, ready to take on the world. It was my first real camping experience far from home, and our troop was heading to Mount San Gorgonio for the weekend. That mountain, standing at 3,500 meters tall, was like a beacon to us boys, towering high against the horizon, whispering promises of great adventures. Our troop was led by Scoutmaster McFunny, and we were a close-knit group of boys from the same neighborhood. Juana, however, was the quiet kid, and I'm sure you know the type. Smart and always a little on the sidelines, watching from the outside. He had thick plastic glasses that made his eyes look huge. He was a bit bulkier than the rest of us, but nobody teased him about it. We all liked him. He had a dry sense of humor, the kind that catches you off guard when you least expect it. Juana wasn't the loudest, but when he spoke, everyone listened. The whole troop had been talking about this trip for weeks. Most of us had never climbed anything that big, and I have to admit I was a little nervous. But that first night, camping under the stars, all those worries seemed so distant. We were huddled around the campfire, the sky so clear you felt like you could reach out and grab one of the stars right in front of you. The air was cool, the fire crackled, we were roasting marshmallows and laughing as we told stories. Juana stayed quiet most of the time, but I saw him smile, his glasses reflecting the flames. Scoutmaster McFunny told us to go to bed early. "We have a big hike ahead of us tomorrow," he said. I remember the excitement running through the group at that moment. We were no longer going on just a simple hike. We were going to conquer that mountain, and it would be the highlight of the trip. Morning came quickly, and I woke up to Scoutmaster McFunny shouting at us to get up. We ate some oatmeal with apples, packed our things, and began the hike. The plan was simple: climb to the summit, take some photos, and get back to camp before nightfall. It sounded easy when we were sitting around the campfire the night before, but once we started the ascent, it was clear that it would be much harder than any of us had expected. The first stretch wasn't so bad. We were full of energy, laughing and racing along the trail. But as we climbed, the air grew thinner, and the trees became sparser. The trail began to zigzag with increasingly steeper switchbacks. The heat, the dust, the thin air, it all weighed on us. Juana was struggling more than anyone, even at the lower elevations. He was lagging behind from the beginning, and after a few hours he was several switchbacks behind us. The scout leaders had to keep calling out to him, reminding him to stay on the trail and take it easy. We tried to cheer him on with shouts of, "Come on, Juana, you can do it!" and "just a little more." But he was not having a good time. His face was red, and he was breathing heavily like he'd just run a marathon. I'm fine," he kept saying as he wiped the sweat from his forehead, his glasses constantly slipping down his nose. At one point, I hung back just to walk with him. "Are you okay, Juana?" I asked. He nodded, but his breathing was short and ragged. "Yeah, I just need a minute." I stayed with him a little longer, but as the trail got steeper, the troop began to pull farther and farther ahead. Scoutmaster McFunny called out to me, "Go catch up with the others, Juana's fine. We'll make sure he's okay." I hesitated but nodded and ran to catch up with the others. When I looked back, Juana was just a small figure in the distance, hunched over with his hands on his knees. The summit was closer now. You could feel the excitement in the group as the trail leveled out. The rocky path gave way to a clearing that stretched toward the peak. We all started talking about who would get there first. "I'll beat you to the top," one of the boys shouted, and before I knew it, we were all running. My lungs burned, but the sight of the summit filled me with adrenaline. I don't remember exactly who got there first, but I do remember that view. How the world spread out beneath us, the valleys and forests fading into the horizon, and the sky so blue it hurt to look at. We pulled out our disposable cameras and took pictures of everyone with our arms raised in victory. We literally felt like we were on top of the world. But then the minutes began to pass. We all looked down the trail, expecting Juana to appear. 10 minutes, 15 minutes, nothing. Juana didn't show up. Scoutmaster McFunny frowned and said something to Mr. Stephen, one of the other leaders. "I'm going to go look for him," he said, putting on his hat and heading back down the trail. We waited, making small talk to pass the time, but the mood had definitely changed. It was taking too long, and I started to get that knot in my stomach, the one you get when you know something is wrong, but you can't quite figure out what. Another 10 minutes passed, then 20. Scoutmaster McFunny still hadn't come back. Mr. Stephen muttered something and went after him. When he finally returned, his face was pale. "He's not on the trail," he said. "What do you mean he's not on the trail?" I asked, my voice sounding weak. "I mean he's not there," Mr. Stephen replied, his voice tense. "Guys, we need to move now." We ran down the mountain, our boots pounding the dirt trail. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows among the trees, and with every step that sense of dread grew stronger. Juana wasn't on the trail. He wasn't anywhere. The leaders shouted his name over and over, their voices echoing through the trees, but there was no response, just the wind whispering through the pines and the crunch of our footsteps. We started checking every side path, every little trail that branched off from the main one. Nothing. I felt the panic bubbling inside me, a growing fear that maybe he had taken a wrong turn, maybe he had slipped and fallen somewhere. Scoutmaster McFunny then sent half of the group back to the base camp while he and Mr. Stephen stayed behind to keep searching. I remember the expressions on their faces, grave, desperate, like they were trying to stay calm, but knew they were quickly losing control. When we got back to camp, we still hadn't found him, and that's when they pulled out the radio. I saw Scoutmaster McFunny with his trembling hand calling for help. "One of our scouts is missing," he said. "We need a search and rescue team here now." The next few hours are a bit of a blur in my memory. The search and rescue teams arrived, dozens of them. They scoured the mountain, bringing dogs, helicopters, everything. They told us to pack up our things. We weren't going to stay. It was obviously too dangerous for us kids, especially with the sun setting. I didn't want to leave. None of us did. But they took us back to the cars and drove us home. I didn't sleep at all that night. All I could think about was Juana alone on the mountain in the dark. What would he be doing? Was he still trying to find his way back? Was he hurt? Scared? Days passed, then weeks, and Juana didn't come home. They found his backpack, some candy wrappers, and his camera. Nothing else. The photos from that camera still give me chills when I think about them. Most were just pictures of the mountain landscape, trees, rocks. But the last one, that last photo, was different. They searched for over a week, but they never found him. I can still feel the crunch of the earth beneath my boots from that day in 1991, the way the dry mountain air burned my throat. It was a warm weekend in late summer, early September, and the sky above me in the San Bernardino Mountains was painted a pale, cloudless blue. It seemed like a perfect day for a hike, and that's the thing about nature. It has a way of lulling you into a false sense of security before pulling the rug out from under your feet. There were at least a dozen Boy Scout troops camped at the base of the mountain that year. Everyone was getting ready for the day's climb to San Gorgonio, the highest peak in Southern California. There were boys from all over the state, from 11-year-olds, fresh and naive, to 15-year-olds who thought they knew it all. My troop was from San Diego, just one among many. I didn't personally know most of the other boys or their leaders, but when you're out in nature, everyone looks out for one another. It's an unwritten rule. That's when I first saw Juana, and I didn't think twice about trying to keep him in line. I wasn't part of his troop. He was from a group out of El Monte, a suburb of Los Angeles, but I had seen him struggling along the trail that morning, falling behind. He was short, somewhat stocky, and clearly not in the best shape for this climb. His face was flushed, and he was already sweating buckets before we even reached the steeper parts of the trail. I remember thinking he looked out of place, like a fish out of water, but the kid had some determination. He wasn't fast or agile, but he kept going no matter how far behind he fell. He simply didn't give up. That was refreshing to see. It was the exact kind of tenacity we tried to teach all the boys, that they could do hard things. Half of our job was purely encouragement. "You okay, kid?" I called out the first time I noticed how far back he was. I was making sure my own boys stayed on the trail, handing out snacks and water, when I saw Juana about 800 meters behind his own troop. This wasn't unusual. I had been checking on lagging boys throughout the ascent. One boy would fall behind or linger too long at a rest area, and I'd take note of his troop number on his uniform and tell his scoutmaster. That usually got them marching back up the mountain. Juana was different, though. He didn't seem to care if he got in trouble, and I noticed that right away. He looked at me, smiling. It was an odd smile, kind of sly, like he knew something I didn't. He gave me a small wave, wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, and then glanced over his shoulder like he was expecting someone to come up behind him. But when I looked back, there was no one else there. "Just try to stay with your group," I told him, more out of habit than anything else. "You don't want to get separated." He just smiled again, waved me off, and kept going, his feet kicking up little clouds of dust as he climbed the slope. There's something about that smile that still haunts me. It wasn't the look of a tired or scared kid. It was almost like he was playing some kind of game, like he was daring someone to catch him, to say something. The first few kilometers of the hike went by quickly. Most of the boys were in good spirits, excited to reach the summit and plant their troop flags. The younger ones moved a bit slower, but they managed to keep up. I kept an eye on all of them, offering encouragement whenever someone seemed ready to give up. The trail was steep, but manageable, at least for most of us. I saw Juana a few more times as we climbed the mountain, each time further and further behind his troop. Every time, that same smile on his face. I saw him glance over his shoulder a couple of times as if someone were following him, but every time I looked, the trail was empty. We reached a halfway point where we stopped at a small clearing to rest and grab some water and snacks. Most of the boys were red-faced and sweaty, but still in good spirits, excited to be so close to the summit. I looked around for Juana, half expecting to see him lagging behind as usual, but he wasn't there. "Has anyone seen Juana, the kid who was falling behind?" I asked the other scoutmasters as we sat catching our breath. One of them, a tall, thin guy named Steve from Juana's troop, shook his head. "The last I saw him, he was on the trail. The kid's been dragging his feet all day." I nodded, but something didn't sit right with me. I scanned the trail behind us, looking for any sign of him, but the path was empty. "You want me to go back and look for him?" I offered. "He might need help." Steve waved me off. "He's a tough kid, stubborn as they come, I admit, but he knows what he's doing. He'll catch up eventually." I wasn't so sure, but I didn't argue. Juana technically wasn't my responsibility. My own boys were, and they were starting to get restless. We had a schedule to keep, and we couldn't afford to fall behind. Just as I was letting myself be carried away by the worry, I glanced back, and there he was, climbing up behind us. He was red and covered in sweat, but he kept putting one foot in front of the other. The last time I saw him, he glanced over his shoulder once more. I really wondered what the hell he could be looking at. We pushed on to the last mile or so before the summit, when we began the final stretch. The trail was steeper now, the switchbacks curling up the mountainside. The boys struggled to keep pace. I tried to keep them moving, but my mind kept drifting back to Juana. I hadn't seen him since the last rest stop, and his absence gnawed at me. Half a mile from the summit, I saw him again. He was quite far away, but now he was heading down the mountain, not up. At first I thought maybe I was seeing things, but as I watched, I realized it was definitely Juana. He wasn't on the trail anymore. He was cutting down the steep rocky slope like he was in a hurry to get back to camp. "Juana," I yelled, cupping my hands around my mouth. "What are you doing? Get back here." He didn't even look at me. He just kept moving, sliding between the rocks, taking shortcuts no sensible person would attempt. We had very specific rules to avoid that kind of thing, the number one being to stay on the trail. This is a dangerous mountain, and sliding down it could be a death sentence. Juana was about 1,200 meters behind us, but almost directly below us on the trail. I stood there for a moment, torn between going after him or staying with my troop. We were so close to the summit now. The other scoutmasters were just ahead of me, and I figured one of them would run into Juana and get him back on track. Finally, I decided to push forward and notify a scoutmaster, as I had my own troop to worry about. But my gut kept twisting. Something just didn't feel right. "Stay here," I told my assistant scoutmaster, a young guy named Matt, before turning and jogging back toward the trail after Juana. "I'll be right back." When I got to where I had seen him last, Juana was already gone. The trail below was empty, the only sound the wind whispering through the trees. I called his name again, but there was no response. This was not good, but of course I had seen him go down, so obviously he wasn't there. That's when those first threads of fear started creeping up my spine. I ran back up to the summit, my heart racing. I found Steve and the other leaders gathered at the top. They were all relaxed, the boys huddled around a small campfire chatting excitedly about the climb. I felt like I was about to shake their world, but we needed to get moving to get down the mountain if we wanted to catch up with that kid. "Hey," I said, out of breath as I approached. "I saw Juana going down. He was sliding between the switchbacks. Did any of you see him?" Steve frowned, looking at the other scoutmasters. "No, I haven't seen him all afternoon. Are you sure it was him?" "I'm sure," I replied. "He was going downhill, cutting between the rocks. I yelled at him, but he ignored me." Steve cursed under his breath. "Damn it. That kid never listens. I'll go see if I can catch up to him. Probably just got scared or tired." "Which shortcut was it?" "The one that goes sliding between the switchbacks," I replied. "Damn it," was all Steve said. He told his troop to pack up their things and get ready to head back to the base camp. Since my troop had just arrived, we stayed a while enjoying the sunset view and resting. I watched Steve load up his backpack and set off back down the trail, his figure quickly disappearing among the trees. The rest of us stayed at the summit for a while, hoping he would find his lost Boy Scout and everything would be okay. The rest of his troop marched behind him, looking in all directions for any sign of Juana. Half an hour later, we were all back on our own journey down to camp. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon. I tried to keep my boys entertained by singing songs and playing guessing games to keep their minds occupied, but my mind kept drifting back to Juana. Where the hell was this kid? Why the hell did he ignore me? It all felt super weird, and I was just glad that a scoutmaster had finally gotten involved. As we descended, we could see the other group pretty far ahead, but since they were looking for Juana, we were starting to catch up with them. When we finally caught up to Steve, it was almost night. His face was now grim, and he shook his head before I even had a chance to ask. All his assistant scoutmasters looked equally distraught, and I realized quickly that their troop was completely lost. They shined their flashlights back and forth, calling out repeatedly, but they never got an answer. "We didn't find him," Steve said quietly. "I followed the trail all the way back to camp, but there's no sign of him. It's literally like he just disappeared." I felt the panic boil inside me. "Did you check those shortcuts?" "He wasn't on the trail when I saw him. He was cutting between the switchbacks." Steve nodded. "I looked everywhere. There are no footprints, no sign of him at all. It's like he vanished into thin air." "And you went all the way to the bottom?" I clarified. "Yes, all the way down and then all the way back up. Nothing. And he's not at camp either." We rushed back to our base camp as fast as we could safely, while we informed other Boy Scout troops about the situation. Other troops began forming small teams to comb the base of the mountain and aim lights up toward the mountain trail, guiding in case he was potentially up there while Steve went to make the call. He walked about 8 kilometers through the darkness to the nearest ranger station to notify emergency services. The search started that night, and word spread quickly around the camp. I'd say within an hour, all available adults were scouring the mountainside. Flashlights cut through the darkness, voices calling Juana's name. All the boys stayed in camp, huddled in their tents, but I could see the fear in their eyes. As the night wore on, that uneasy feeling only got worse. Something was wrong. Juana wasn't just lost. He was gone, and no one knew where or why. When the professional search and rescue teams arrived, they scoured the area for any sign of Juana. They found a single footprint that matched his size, but nothing else. No more footprints, no gear, nothing but the mountain and the empty sky. Then, on the 3rd day, they found his camera. It was lying in a shallow ravine, half buried under a pile of rocks. The film inside had been exposed, but they managed to salvage some photos. Most were of the surrounding nature, trees, rocks, mountains in the distance. But the last photo was different. It was a close-up of Juana's face taken in the dark. His eyes were wide open, his expression confused, almost scared. That photo sent a chill down my spine, and to this day, that's the last clue of Juana that has ever been found. When I got the call about Juana, I didn't think much of it. These things happen all the time, especially in the mountains and especially with kids. I had been a search and rescue volunteer for nearly 15 years at this point, and most of the time it was routine. A lost hiker or a kid who had wandered off, or someone who had underestimated the difficulty of the trail. Usually you find them within a few hours, maybe a day at most. They're scared but fine, they have a story to tell, and we have a job well done. But Juana was different. I remember driving up those winding roads that weekend. The sun was already sinking behind the mountain peaks, and the sky had that hazy orange hue that makes everything look almost unreal. And I had this weird feeling in my gut that I couldn't shake. Maybe it was just the altitude, or maybe it was the way the radio crackled as it relayed the details, but I felt uneasy. I shrugged it off. This was supposed to be a simple job. The kid gets lost in the woods, we find him, everybody goes home. That's how it's supposed to work. When I got to the staging area, there were already some teams gearing up. Juana's troop hadn't wasted any time calling us, which was a good sign. The kid hadn't been missing for long, just a few hours, and the terrain wasn't that bad. The trail system in this part of the San Bernardino Mountains was pretty well mapped, and it wasn't an unforgiving wilderness. This was a place where families hiked on weekends. We all thought it would be pretty hard for someone to actually get lost here. It was open terrain with clear paths, and most of the trails connected to each other or led to the same area. Juana's troop was hiking to the summit, a pretty big climb for a 12-year-old, but not overly dangerous. The plan was to reach the top and then head back to camp before dark. Simple enough, but somehow Juana slipped through the cracks. One minute he was there, and the next he wasn't. It didn't make sense, at least not at first. As we continued to organize the search, I couldn't help but feel a growing frustration toward the scoutmasters. These kids are their responsibility, and yet somehow they managed to lose one. I talked to some of them, and their stories were all over the place. One of them, a tall guy with graying hair, kept shaking his head like he couldn't believe what had happened. "We were all together," he insisted. "He was lagging behind, but we kept checking on him. He was fine." "And how far behind was he?" I asked, trying not to let my irritation show. "A few hundred meters, maybe," said the scoutmaster, looking at the ground. "We told him to stay with the group, but he trailed off, his face pale. He just kept falling behind." I bit back an angry response. Hundreds of meters was too far, way more than it should have been, especially for a kid his age at 3,350 meters elevation. The altitude alone could affect you. The trail was steep. There was no way they should have let him get that far back without someone staying with him. "And then what?" I pressed. "What happened next?" The scoutmaster shrugged helplessly. "We got to the top and turned around, and he wasn't there. We thought maybe, just maybe, he had gone back to camp. We sent someone after him, but..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. That was the last anyone saw of Juana. Just like that, a boy vanished. The initial feeling among the search team was cautiously optimistic. After all, he hadn't been missing for long, and the weather was good. We thought he'd just wandered off the trail, maybe taken a wrong turn. We'd find him soon, but the hours ticked by, and the sun sank lower in the sky, and things started to feel different. The first hours of searching turned up nothing. No footprints, no dropped gear, no sign of Juana anywhere. It was almost as if the mountain had swallowed him whole. The scoutmasters were a mess, pacing back and forth, muttering to each other in low voices. One of them, a younger guy with a nervous tic, started talking about mountain lions. "There's been one in this area before," he said, wringing his hands. "A kid his size, he could have been dragged off." But there was no blood, no signs of a struggle. If Juana had been attacked by an animal, we would have seen something. Tracks, fur, something. But there was nothing. Another theory started circulating, one that really gave me the creeps. Some of the searchers wondered if Juana hadn't just wandered off. Maybe someone had taken him. Maybe he had been abducted or worse. I didn't want to believe it, but the idea lodged itself in my mind and wouldn't let go. A kid doesn't just disappear like that. The first days of that search were a mix of frustration and exhaustion. We combed the mountain, scouring every inch of the trails, calling Juana's name until our voices were hoarse. We found nothing, well, almost nothing. On the second day, someone found a single footprint half buried in the dirt near a switchback. It matched the size of Juana's shoes, but that was it. No more footprints, no trail to follow, just one lonely print. Then, on the third day, we found the camera. It was one of those disposable ones, the kind kids use on school trips. It was lying in the dirt near a rock slide, and when we picked it up, we knew it was his. The device was broken, but they managed to develop the role. I wasn't there when they looked at the photos, but I heard about it afterward. Most of the images were what you'd expect. Pictures of the mountains, trees, the sky, just a kid playing with the camera. But the last photo was different. It was a close-up of Juana's face taken in the dark. His eyes were wide open, his expression confused, scared even. The image was blurry, like it had been taken in a hurry, but no one knew what to make of it. Some of the searchers started whispering that maybe the kid wasn't alone when that photo was taken. Someone or something was with him. By this point, the police were already involved. They started questioning campers in the area, trying to piece together anything that might help us understand where Juana had gone. Most of the campers hadn't seen or heard anything out of the ordinary, but there was one group that told a story that gave some of us nightmares. They were camped on the opposite side of the mountain, a little over a kilometer from where Juana disappeared. According to them, they saw something that night just around sunset. At first, they thought it was a man lurking at the edges of their camp, but when it got dark, they realized it wasn't a man. It was too tall, and whatever it was wasn't wearing clothes. Now keep in mind, this is their description. They described it as some kind of creature with long limbs and pale skin. It didn't make any noise. It just stood there watching. They tried to scare it off by yelling, throwing rocks, and waving burning sticks, but it didn't move. It just stood there, observing. Eventually, it walked off into the woods, and they thought that was the end of it. But later that night, they heard something in the distance, strange noises like someone or something still moving through the trees. Then came the screams. The campers said they heard the screams of a child echoing through the mountain in the same direction that creature had gone. They didn't know what to do, so they stayed in their tents, terrified until morning. When they heard about Juana, they went straight to the ranger station to report what they had heard and seen. But by then it was too late. I know what you're thinking, but that story stuck with me. As the search continued, every time we went into the woods calling Juana's name, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The air felt heavy, like something was watching us from the trees. But we had a job to do, and I tried to focus on that. After a week of searching, we were all desperate. The chances of finding Juana alive were now very slim. We all knew it, but I had a theory, one I hadn't shared with anyone. I had been piecing it together in my mind since I heard the scoutmasters talking about how Juana had been sliding between the switchbacks. It wasn't uncommon for kids to do that, cutting the path to save time. But this mountain is different. Those switchbacks are steep. If you're not careful, you could easily lose control and fall. I knew the area well and had a hunch about where Juana might have gone. There was a canyon at the base of the mountain, just over a kilometer from where he was last seen. It was overgrown, wild, with no trails leading into it. If Juana had slipped too far, he could have easily ended up in that canyon, and if he did, he was probably already dead. I decided to check it out myself. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, just grabbed my gear and headed toward the switchbacks. When I got there, I stood at the top, looking down those steep, rocky slopes. It wasn't hard to imagine a kid like Juana losing his footing here, especially with the fading light. I followed the trail down for about a kilometer, even tried the sliding technique myself. It was dangerous, but it worked, at least for a while. Then I reached the edge of the canyon. It was just as I remembered, wild, overgrown, completely cut off from the rest of the mountain. If Juana had gone down here, no one would have seen him, and no one would have found him. I radioed in my location and then descended into the canyon, calling his name the whole time, but I knew it was pointless. That canyon was too big and too wild. If he had ever been here, he was gone now. The reality was that he could have gone down the canyon with confidence. There are animal trails visible from the top that could look like a main trail in the fading light. I think Juana slipped right off the trail he was supposed to stay on and unwittingly veered in the wrong direction while descending into the canyon. The actual trail arched the other way, toward camp. Now all of this is just a theory, but it makes more sense than the others. After that, they brought in helicopters with infrared cameras, but nothing. The search went on for 19 days in total, and Juana was never found. I still think about him sometimes, especially when I'm in those mountains. I think about that camera, about that last photo he took. I think about those other campers and that thing they saw. I wonder, did we miss something? Did we overlook something in those woods? Something we weren't supposed to see? Or was it something else? Something we will never understand. All I know is that Juana went into those mountains and never came back. Rest in peace, kid. In 1969, an adventure magazine reporter named Milt Macklin flew to New Guinea with his film crew to shoot a documentary about a person who had disappeared in that area. Milt's hope was to find this missing person and capture it on camera, which would really take his documentary to the next level. However, despite filming all this material and searching everywhere, they never found the missing person. So Milt finally returned home and stored all the footage in a warehouse without even looking at it. 4 years later, that material was taken out of storage because another team wanted to make a documentary about the missing person, and when they watched the footage, they found something truly incredible. On the morning of Saturday, November 18, 1961, a 23-year-old man named Michael Rockefeller pulled the cord of the outboard motor on the boat he was traveling in. Michael pulled and pulled that cord, but he couldn't get the motor to restart. It just sputtered and wouldn't start. Without the motor, this meant that Michael and his small crew were drifting further out to sea. But that wasn't the worst part of the situation. The boat Michael and his crew were in, a catamaran about 12 meters long, was starting to sink. Minutes before, Michael and his crew had been happily traveling along the beautiful jungle coastline of New Guinea when they had to cross an area where the water was particularly turbulent. There was a river in New Guinea that flowed into the Arafura Sea, where Michael and his crew were, and where the brown river water met the blue sea water. It became very rough with many choppy waves. So as Michael and his crew tried to cross that area, waves came aboard, flooded the motor and shut it down. Then, as more and more waves poured into the boat, it began to sink. The reason Michael and his crew were there, taking this risk, was because Michael wanted to see a tribe called the Asmat, who lived in New Guinea, just beyond this area where the river was, along the coast. Michael was obsessed with the art created by the Asmat tribe, particularly their unique bice poles. These poles were made by the master carvers of the Asmat tribe. What they did was take a single piece of wood and carve it until it looked like a group of men standing on each other's shoulders. These bice poles are utterly beautiful, intricate and wonderful to see. But the Asmat don't make them as art. They make them because they believe they contain the souls of their tribe's warriors who have died in battle. And until the Asmat avenge these fallen warriors, that is, until the tribe kills their enemies, those souls remain trapped in the bis poles. This means the Asmat almost never part with these poles. They don't sell them or discard them. They are simply part of their culture and society. But months earlier, Michael had visited the Asmat tribe, learned about the bis poles and what they meant, and he believed he had negotiated a deal with them to exchange some of his own goods for one of these bis poles. But even though Michael gave them all the things he had offered, they never sent him the bis pole. So now Michael was returning in hopes of being able to claim the bis pole and take it with him. But as Michael sat in his sinking catamaran, watching the muddy coast of New Guinea drift further away as he was swept out to sea in the Arafura, the last thing on his mind was the bis pole. He needed to figure out what they were going to do. Michael's crew consisted of 3 other people. There was a French anthropologist named René, and 2 teenagers who were Asmat guides named Simon and Leo. So, after Michael failed to start the engine, all 3 tried pulling the cord, but they couldn't get it to start either. Finally, Simon and Leo spoke and told Michael and René that at this point they believed their only hope was to abandon the catamaran, jump into the ocean and swim to shore, which at that time was about 800 meters away. But they were drifting out to sea so fast that if they waited much longer, they might be too far away to make the swim. However, René wasn't a good swimmer, and Michael simply wasn't ready to completely abandon the boat and let it sink, because aboard the catamaran was everything he had brought: tobacco, fishing line, clothes, candy, and a bunch of different things he knew this tribe didn't have, and could use as leverage to keep negotiating to get his bias pole and acquire other works of art they might offer. And even though Michael understood that obviously the catamaran and everything on board were going to sink at some point, he just wasn't mentally prepared to jump now and abandon all these things. So it was decided that the 2 Asmat guides, the 2 teenagers Simon and Leo, would jump into the water alone, swim to shore and try to get help, while Michael and René would stay behind and wait for that help to arrive. So, moments later, the 2 teenagers jumped into the water and began their long swim to shore. As they did so, Michael watched them and suddenly realized how far he was from home. Michael hadn't showered in months, so he smelled terrible. was completely sunburned, covered in dirt, and his hands were rough and calloused from all the rowing he had done. But that wasn't Michael's real life, because Michael wasn't from New Guinea or anywhere nearby. He was from the United States, where his family was one of the most well-known, influential, and wealthy in human history. The Rockefeller family is among the top 10 most powerful people in history. Michael's grandfather was oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller, who at the time was literally the richest man in the world, and Michael's father, Nelson Rockefeller, was at the time the governor of New York and a future vice president of the United States. But despite having these incredible resources at his disposal, Michael didn't feel compelled to be a Rockefeller. Instead, he found his calling in the jungles of New Guinea. He had first come here 7 months earlier with a team of filmmakers from Harvard University who were looking to document a very remote tribe, and Michael fell in love with the adventure of that trip, even though on that trip, while filming a battle between this remote tribe and another, Michael was accidentally hit in the shoulder by an arrow. So despite being injured, Michael simply loved being in New Guinea. In fact, Michael never told his family that he had been shot in the shoulder with this arrow because he feared that if he did, the all-powerful Rockefeller family would seek revenge against the tribes that had inadvertently harmed Michael Rockefeller. So Michael was very respectful and protective of the people he met in New Guinea, and in many ways he saw them more as his people than his own family. So after the Harvard filmmakers finished their documentary and returned to the United States, Michael stayed in New Guinea. Meanwhile, his father, Nelson Rockefeller, had opened a museum in New York called the Museum of Primitive Art, which exhibited art from places like New Guinea. This was in the early 1960s, and many Westerners viewed the natives of New Guinea, like the Asmat tribe, as very primitive and backward. Therefore, many people were drawn to this new museum in New York, just for the spectacle it offered, to see what these primitive and backward people were creating. But Michael felt he had a deeper understanding of the natives of New Guinea, and he felt it was his responsibility to go and find the incredible artwork from all over New Guinea, like the bias poles from the Asmat tribe, and send these works of art to his father to be put in the museum. Michael wanted people in the West to appreciate and respect the natives of New Guinea in the same way that he did, and he believed that through art he could achieve this. So Michael partnered with René, the French anthropologist, to go all over New Guinea searching for art to send to his father. A few hours after Simon and Leo jumped from the sinking catamaran and began swimming to shore, Michael and René had no idea if they had made it to land. They hadn't seen anyone come to rescue them, and as far as they knew, they had no idea how close they were to being rescued or not. Looking down, they saw their catamaran sinking further and further, so at one point, Michael and René grabbed buckets and started bailing water from the catamaran, which was totally useless because the water was coming in too fast, but they had nothing else to do. Suddenly, a sudden wave came and flipped the entire catamaran, throwing Michael and René into the sea. Luckily, Michael and René managed to swim to the surface and swam to the catamaran, which was now upside down. There was an air pocket trapped underneath, so it stayed afloat, and Michael and René clung to the catamaran. Michael also grabbed a gas can that had come out of the boat and tied it to his belt as a flotation device. So he and René held onto the capsized catamaran, and Michael leaned on the gas can while they continued to wait for Simon and Leo to have reached shore and for help to arrive. But in the back of Michael's mind, he knew that if help didn't arrive soon, he might have to do something drastic like try swimming himself, which was now a much greater distance than the original 800 meters they had estimated. The next morning, when the sun rose, Michael and René were still in the water clinging to the catamaran, hoping for help to arrive. But it didn't. Now Michael was a very good swimmer, but by this time he knew they were at least about 8 or maybe even 16 kilometers from shore, so it would be an exhausting swim in pretty rough waters. But Michael, being a Rockefeller, was very confident in himself and began telling René that he would make the swim and that he could do it. René begged Michael not to go, but Michael said he had to do something, otherwise they would die there. So all René could do was watch Michael strip off some of his clothes and tie another gas can to his belt to give him a bit more flotation. Then Michael shook René's hand, and around 8 in the morning on Sunday, November 19th, 1961, Michael began to swim. About 12 hours later that night, while René was still clinging to the catamaran, hoping for help to arrive soon, suddenly, almost without warning, the sky lit up with an incredibly bright flare. What had happened was that a passing plane had seen René and the overturned catamaran and fired a flare into the air to let him know they had seen him and that they would be sending help. A couple of hours later, A boat arrived and picked up Renee. When Renee got on board, he felt very relieved and asked the captain, "Did Michael Rockefeller tell you I was here? Is that how you knew I was here?" The captain replied, "No, it was two teenagers, two guides, Simon and Leo, who told us you were here. No one has heard from Michael." Now you must remember that Michael Rockefeller was a Rockefeller, so when Renee heard, "Oh my God, we don't know where Michael is," and told the captain that Michael had started this incredibly long swim to shore to get help, it was as if a bomb had exploded in the Rockefeller family, and they committed all their money, resources, and influence to launch what was practically the largest search in history to find Michael. They sent boats, helicopters, and planes, got in touch with the U.S. Navy to get them fully involved. They searched everywhere for weeks, but they couldn't find Michael. This search would continue for years. It wouldn't be as intense as in the first few weeks, but there was always someone or some entity looking for Michael in the area where he had begun his swim. But by 1964, 3 years after Michael started his swim, the Rockefeller family finally accepted that Michael must be dead, that he had likely drowned in those 8 or 16 kilometers of swimming to shore. For 60 years, I've been an enthusiast of whale mail, but unfortunately in the past 6 decades, no whale has understood that it was my messenger. So I finally decided to join the future and rely on Stamps.com for all my shipping needs. For 25 years, Stamps.com has been helping businesses save time and money. Back to the story, when the family finally accepted what had happened, that became the official version of events in the United States. Michael Rockefeller had drowned trying to swim to shore. But in New Guinea, a very different story began to spread about what really happened to Michael. Rumors about his fate were whispered along trade routes among visiting missionaries and gossiped about in tabloids and adventure magazines. In 1969, 5 years after Michael was declared dead by his family, an adventure magazine reporter named Milt Macklin heard from a mysterious Australian who claimed to have found Michael Rockefeller recently in the jungles of New Guinea, not far from where he had supposedly disappeared. Milt decided to follow this lead, despite how unbelievable it was, and went to New Guinea with a film crew. He searched everywhere for Michael, talked to locals, combed the area, but found no sign of him. Milt, feeling very disappointed, returned home and wrote a book about his search for Michael Rockefeller, which became a bestseller. But crucially, although he had filmed a lot of footage, both from afar and up close, of all the tribes in the area where Michael was supposedly located, he and his team never really reviewed the footage. 40 years later, another film crew decided to go to New Guinea to look for Michael because there were still all these rumors that Michael was alive and living in the jungles of New Guinea. Before going to New Guinea, they discovered this unseen footage of Milt Macklin and watched it all. They discovered something incredible among hours and hours of footage. There is a brief shot taken from a distance where the crew was filming from land toward the water, and a canoe enters the frame full of Asmat warriors. This was a war party presumably headed into battle with another tribe. But among these large and strong men, there was one man who stood out completely because he didn't look like the other Asmat warriors. He was a white man, naked and bearded, who, despite the poor quality of the video, looked a lot like Michael Rockefeller. So as soon as the news of this footage spread, rumors quickly began circulating worldwide about how this heir to a multi-million-dollar fortune had decided to walk away from his family and live among the Asmat tribe as one of them. Now again, we have no idea if it really was Michael Rockefeller. It could easily have been a missionary or another white person who was in New Guinea, but the story was incredible and spread everywhere. In 2012, 4 years after this unseen footage of Milt Macklin came to light and more than 50 years since Michael Rockefeller disappeared, a National Geographic journalist named Carl Hoffman, who had grown up fascinated by the mystery surrounding Michael Rockefeller, decided to go to New Guinea and finally get to the bottom of what had happened to Michael. After Carl and his interpreter lived with the Asmat tribe for months, earning their trust and respect, they began to tell him a new story about what really happened to Michael, a story that he had never heard before. They also gave him a terrible warning. If he ever told what really happened, the entire village could be killed, and maybe even he too. But Carl didn't listen. After hearing what really happened to Michael, he left New Guinea and wrote a book about it called Savage Harvest. Here's what happened to Michael Rockefeller. On the morning of November 19, 1961, about 24 hours after Michael jumped into the water and began his 8 to 16-kilometer swim to shore for help, 3 Asmat elders named Finn, Jim, and Pep were among 50 other members of the tribe in 8 long canoes. They weren't going anywhere. They were just resting at the mouth of this river, the same river that flowed into the Arafura Sea, exactly where Michael and his crew had encountered those turbulent waters that overturned their catamaran and caused the whole situation. So all these members of the tribe were there, some smoking hand-rolled cigars, others chewing flour made from a palm plant called sago. They were all naked except for some bands around their knees and elbows, and some with intricate piercings in their noses and ears. They were just there, enjoying a moment of peace and tranquility after a long day. Suddenly Jim, one of the elders, noticed something moving toward the river from the sea. It was something white moving toward them, and Jim immediately called the others to look. "Look, there's something there. It's a white crocodile, a snake, something." Everyone looked and watched as this white object got closer and closer, so, to avoid being caught off guard, the whole group prepared and began paddling toward the white thing, because if it was a threat, they could deal with it, and if it wasn't, so be it. When the 8 canoes converged on this white thing, some with spears raised ready to strike, they realized it was neither a snake nor a crocodile. It was a white man floating on his back with some strange flotation devices on him, but he wasn't a threat. Immediately everyone lowered their spears, laughed thinking they had felt danger for a second, and this white man, who was Michael Rockefeller, turned over and looked up, unable to believe what he was seeing. He had swum nearly 16 kilometers to get there and found himself with the tribe he had come to see in the first place. They had come to rescue him. Practically crying with relief, Michael turned around and grabbed onto one of their canoes. As soon as he did, one of the elders, Pep, looked at him holding onto their boat, then looked at the other 2 elders, Finn and Jim, and they all looked at each other, then at Michael, and then back at each other. Then they nodded in agreement and Pep helped Michael into the boat. Michael lay in the middle of the boat, exhausted from the swim but relieved. He lay there while the tribe got back into position, turned the canoes and began paddling upriver into the interior. As they paddled, they began chanting a very strange song. The 8 canoes, the more than 50 members of the tribe, all in unison began this chant. And Michael, who had studied the Asmat tribe and felt he knew much of their culture, had never heard this chant before. He felt mesmerized by the chant and tried to ask them what it meant, but they completely ignored him and continued paddling and chanting. Michael simply stayed there listening, being taken to what he thought was safety. Suddenly the chanting stopped, and the canoes turned and headed toward a small tributary that led to a clearing on the shore. Michael noticed they were slowing down and raised himself up a bit and looked over the edge of the boat to see if they were at their village, but he saw no village in sight, just this clearing on the shore. Immediately, Michael thought that he hoped they would go to the village soon because he had to find someone who could contact the authorities, who could then go and rescue Renee, and hopefully find Simon and Leo as well. Michael tried to ask the men in the canoe if they would help him, but of course there was a huge language barrier, and neither side really understood each other. At some point, one of the men of the Asmat tribe began laughing at Michael, and when he did, most of the other members of the tribe looked, saw what was happening, and also laughed at Michael. Michael didn't understand what was going on. Before he could do anything else, the entire tribe stopped laughing, and in an instant they returned to that rhythmic chanting as they slowly began getting out of their canoes and heading to the shore. Michael began to feel that something was wrong and instinctively lay back down in the canoe, as if trying to distance himself from them. The man who had first laughed at Michael stood over him, continuing the chant, smiled, and raised his spear. Then he thrust it into Michael's side, who screamed in pain but had no strength to defend himself and turned to the other side in the canoe, trying to protect himself. The man raised his spear again with a big smile and thrust it into Michael's other side. After pulling out the spear, Michael, in terrible pain, managed, maybe with adrenaline, to get up and crawl over the edge of the canoe, falling into the mud. He tried to stand up to get away, but there was nowhere to go, and as he struggled in the mud, 2 of the men from the tribe grabbed his arms and began dragging him across the clearing toward the jungle. As they dragged him, the chant continued, and periodically Michael heard someone blowing a horn. Michael was dragged along the shore into the jungle and then into another clearing, not near their village. They put him on his knees in the center of this clearing, protecting his sides with his arms, incredibly weak, while the tribe formed a circle around him, maintaining the chant. At some point, one of the men approached Michael, took his head and pushed it forward, exposing the back of his neck. Another member of the tribe approached with an axe, while the chanting and horns continued, and raised the axe, bringing it down on the back of Michael's neck. It turns out the Asmat tribe knew who Michael was. They remembered him from his visit months earlier when he tried to negotiate for their bias poles. They had been deeply offended that this rich white man came and thought he could simply buy one of their sacred artifacts as if it were a trinket to put in a museum. They had harbored a deep hatred toward him. That was why they never sent the bis pole. They didn't plan to give it to him. But when Michael miraculously appeared floating in their river, the three village elders, Finn, Jim, and Pep, looked at each other and nodded in agreement that they would ritually execute Michael to avenge the deaths of many of their fallen warriors, whose souls were apparently trapped in those bias poles, since many of their warriors had been killed by white men in the past. The chant that Michael heard was the chant they did when performing this ritual execution. But they didn't just kill Michael. After the axe came down on his neck, another member of the tribe lifted his head and used a knife to cut off his head. Then, while the chanting continued, other members of the tribe began cutting Michael's body into pieces, separating organs, flesh, and bones into different piles. Then they quickly made a bonfire, cooked, and ate Michael. Of all the body parts they ate, the brain was the most important, and only Finn, Jim, and Pep, the three elders, were allowed to eat it. After finishing their meal, they took all the meat they hadn't consumed and stored it in their bags to eat later. Finn, one of the elders, took Michael's skull, brought it back to the village, covered it in banana leaves, painted it, and treated it as a trophy. Days later, when the massive search mission passed through the area looking for Michael, the Asmat tribe knew they could never whisper a word about what had happened to him because if it were known, it was highly likely that Westerners would seek revenge. So for decades, their secret remained safe until Hoffman of National Geographic heard the story and wrote a book about it, Savage Harvest. Despite the publication of this book and the fact that many people read it, there were always doubts about the credibility of the story because, remember, there was already a lot of mystery and intrigue surrounding Michael's disappearance. And now, with this new account from the Asmat tribe, no one was really sure how legitimate it was. To this day, the Rockefeller family and generally the authorities consider that Michael Rockefeller drowned while swimming to shore for help. And that's that. That's what happened to Michael Rockefeller according to the testimonies compiled in Carl Hoffman's book, Savage Harvest. The mystery of his disappearance remains one of the most unsettling and disturbing in the history of exploration and contact with isolated indigenous tribes. Although the truth of his fate will likely never be fully verified, the account provides a chilling insight into the cultural dangers and tragic misunderstandings that can occur when two such different worlds collide.